Okay, so picture this. Um, it's 1864, the Civil War is raging, and you've got the sitting president being called, get this, an obscene ape.
Oh, wow.
Not exactly the image that comes to mind when we think of Honest Abe, is it?
It's really amazing, just how much Lincoln's image has been, well, polished, I guess, over time. I mean, he's this American icon now, but back when he was president, he was deeply unpopular with a lot of folks.
Yeah, for sure. And you sent over some really interesting stuff about Lincoln's political life. Steve Inscape's book "Differ We Must" and that through line episode, the one based on the book.
Right.
And I got to say, they paint a very different picture of the guy than what we all learned back in school.
They do. Yeah, they definitely do. And that's what we're going to kind of dig into today, right? The man behind the myth.
Right.
So how did Lincoln, I mean, facing such intense opposition and all, how did he manage to navigate the political landscape and then ultimately lead the nation through its greatest crisis?
I mean, from what I read, it wasn't just idealism and eloquence. This guy was like incredibly savvy politically. I mean, he had to be, right?
Absolutely. He had to be to survive in that era. Take the 1858 Senate race, for example.
Hmm.
It really shows, I think, Lincoln's strategic thinking. He was going up against Stephen Douglas, a pro-slavery Democrat, and the political climate, it was incredibly volatile at the time.
Yeah, the country was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, of course.
Yeah.
And then you had the rise of that Know Nothing Party with their anti-immigrant stance.
Yeah.
And that just added a whole other layer of complexity to everything.
And this is where Lincoln's pragmatism comes in, right?
Yeah.
He personally really, really disliked the Know Nothings. He even wrote once that he'd rather go live in Russia than see them in power. But
Mhm.
but he needed their votes, to have a chance at beating Douglas.
So how did he manage to appeal to a group, that he so fundamentally disagreed with?
Well, by focusing on a common enemy, slavery. So Lincoln strategically emphasized, their shared hatred of slavery while being really careful to avoid any endorsement of their nativist views. He
Hmm.
understood that to achieve his larger goal, of limiting slavery's expansion, he needed to build a broad coalition, even if it meant aligning himself with people he really just found repugnant.
Well, it takes some serious political maneuvering. It makes you wonder, though, about the compromises involved. Like, was he sacrificing his principles for political, expediency?
Well, that's a question that historians have been debating for like over a century now. And it leads us to a really fascinating part of Lincoln's legacy, his stance on black voting rights.
Yeah, from what I gathered in that through line episode, his views seem to they kind of seem to have evolved, or at least shifted, depending on the political context, I guess.
Exactly. In 1854, he was very passionate in arguing that denying black people the vote was, and I'm quoting here, a total destruction of self-government.
Wow,
A powerful statement that resonates even today.
it does. It does.
But then later, during the Civil War, he seemed to, well, downplay the issue. He even suggested he wasn't sure if the Constitution actually gave the government the power to grant black people voting rights.
Yeah.
Inskeep, he argues that this apparent contradiction can be understood if we look at it through the lens of, well, political strategy.
Right.
Lincoln was really, really focused, I mean, laser focused on winning the war and ending slavery.
Yeah.
And he really believed that by kind of, narrowing the debate down to the morality of slavery itself,
Yeah.
he'd have a better chance of achieving that goal.
So he was choosing his battles.
Yeah.
Right? He was pushing for what he thought was achievable at the time, even if it meant delaying progress on other issues.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it makes us think about the complexities of leadership, right? Like, do the ends justify the means? Was Lincoln right to prioritize the abolition of slavery, even if it meant kind of putting other issues like black suffrage on the back burner?
It's a tough question, and it's just fascinating how these dilemmas from Lincoln's time, they still resonate with us today.
Oh, they absolutely do.
Yeah.
Yeah. The moral compromises, the strategic calculations, the struggle to find common ground in a nation that's divided.
Right.
These are all challenges that we continue to face, even in our own time.
Which makes me wonder, beyond the political maneuvering, what were some of Lincoln's personal qualities that allowed him to navigate this tumultuous period?
Well, he was definitely a master communicator.
Yeah.
Both sources really emphasize his approachability,
Mm.
his ability to connect with people from all walks of life.
Right. And of course his legendary storytelling skill.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That through line episode mentioned, this hilarious story about Lincoln trying to well, relieve himself in a friend's hat from a tree.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he apparently told this story in the White House. I mean, I laughed out loud when I heard that.
It's a funny story.
It is.
But what's really interesting is how it shows, I think, Lincoln's use of humor to kind of disarm people and connect with them.
So even his humor was like a political tool. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
Absolutely. He understood the power of personal connection, and he wasn't afraid to use it, strategically.
Speaking of strategic relationships, let's talk about his relationship with George McClellan, the Union Army's commanding general. Both sources paint a picture of just a clash of personalities and ideologies.
Yeah, McClellan, the West Point graduate, he saw Lincoln as this bumbling, uncultured, backwoodsman.
He even referred to him as the original guerrilla.
Wow, that's harsh. And their differences weren't just, personal, right? McClellan had Southern sympathies and he opposed emancipation during the war.
Right. Yes. He believed the war should be about preserving the Union,
Right.
not abolishing slavery. And this put him in direct conflict with Lincoln, who increasingly saw slavery as the core issue that needed to be addressed.
So how did Lincoln manage to work with someone, I mean, that he so fundamentally disagreed with?
Well, that's the fascinating part. Despite their profound differences, Lincoln, he recognized McClellan's military talent.
Yeah.
He knew that to win the war, he needed McClellan's skills, even if he found the man himself personally repugnant.
So he put aside his personal feelings and focused on the bigger picture. Exactly. And it ultimately paid off. Despite their tumultuous relationship, Lincoln's willingness to work with McClellan, even after firing him, once, it led to the Union victory at Antietam.
Which then paved the way for the Emancipation Proclamation, a turning point in the war and in American history.
Precisely. It reminds us that even the most unlikely partnerships can be crucial in achieving a larger goal.
All right, so we've seen how Lincoln, navigated this world of political maneuvering and moral compromises and clashing personalities. But here's the $1,000,000 question: What can we learn from Lincoln in our own, hyper-connected, deeply divided world?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Both sources draw these fascinating parallels between the rapid technological changes of Lincoln's era, the rise of railroads and telegraphs and newspapers and our own experience with the internet and social media.
It's like we're living through our own version of Lincoln's world,
Right.
with all its challenges and possibilities.
Exactly. And it makes us wonder, can Lincoln's strategies for finding common ground and achieving unity, can they be applied today, or are we simply too divided, too entrenched in our own echo chambers to even try? It's a question that's been on my mind a lot, as I've been going through these sources. And, one of the things that really jumped out at me was how Lincoln dealt with, with the Native American issue during the Civil War.
Yeah, it's definitely a side of Lincoln that we don't really hear that much about, especially in those traditional, narratives we usually get.
Exactly. We tend to focus so much on his role in ending slavery, but his approach to Native American issues was much more complex and frankly pretty troubling.
Yeah, the Throughline episode really brought that to light, with the story of Lean Bear,
Right.
that Cheyenne leader who Lincoln invited to the White House.
It's a story that at first, it seems to show Lincoln's his open-mindedness,
Right,
his
yeah.
willingness to engage in dialogue with Native American leaders. He's inviting them to the White House. He's listening to their concerns.
Yeah.
It appears very, very progressive for the time.
It does. But then,
Yeah.
as the episode goes on, you start to see the limitations of Lincoln's approach.
Yeah.
It seems like his main goal, his primary goal, was really just keeping the peace in the West.
Right.
so that he could focus on the war against the Confederacy.
Yeah, and that meant putting the Civil War ahead of addressing the injustices that Native Americans were facing. It's a stark reminder that even someone as as revered as Lincoln,
Yeah.
he was still operating within a very specific historical context, one where racism and prejudice against Native Americans was just deeply ingrained.
So while he was fighting to end slavery in the South, he was essentially turning a blind eye to the suffering of Native Americans in the West.
That's kind of the unsettling implication.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that Lincoln, he knew about the violence and the encroachment that white settlers were inflicting on Native American lands,
All right.
but he chose to prioritize the preservation of the Union above everything else.
And it wasn't just a matter of, looking the other way.
Right.
There were actual policies put in place that had devastating consequences for Native American tribes.
Absolutely. During Lincoln's presidency, you had forced removals, you had massacres, and this ongoing erosion of Native American sovereignty. And while Lincoln himself may not have directly ordered all of these actions, they still happened on his watch, and his focus on the Civil War, it definitely contributed to them.
It's a tough truth to really grapple with, especially considering Lincoln's image as the great emancipator. It forces us to really confront the complexities of his legacy,
Right.
the contradictions between his ideals and his actions.
Precisely. And it raises these uncomfortable questions about the nature of leadership.
Yeah.
The choices that have to be made when you're faced with competing priorities, and the potential for even noble goals to kind of blind us to other injustices.
It makes me think about the parallels to today. How often do we as individuals, or even as a society, how often do we prioritize one cause at the expense of others?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we make sure that our pursuit of justice for some doesn't end up inadvertently perpetuating harm towards others?
Those are really profound questions, and I think they're essential to consider, as we're reflecting on Lincoln's legacy and how it's relevant to our own time.
One thing that both the book and the podcast really highlight is this recurring theme of finding common ground in a divided world.
Mm.
And this story about Lean Bear, it really underlines the challenges that are inherent in that endeavor.
It definitely does. It shows how even well-intentioned efforts at dialogue can be undermined by power imbalances and competing priorities and the weight of historical injustices.
And it makes me think about, the parallels to our own political climate. It feels like we're more divided now than ever.
Yeah.
With each side kind of entrenched in their own beliefs, unwilling to even listen to the other side.
It's a disheartening trend, and I think both sources offer some insightful perspectives on how we might start to bridge these divides.
Yeah.
They draw this really interesting parallel between the technological advancements of Lincoln's time and our own experience with the internet and social media.
That's right. They argue that the rapid rise of railroads and telegraphs and newspapers in Lincoln's era created this similar sense of interconnectedness and information overload that we're seeing today with the digital revolution.
Exactly, and just like those advancements had a huge impact on the political landscape of Lincoln's time, our own technological advancements, they're shaping the way we communicate, the way we engage in political discourse, and the way we form our opinions.
It's almost like history's repeating itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're facing these similar challenges of navigating a rapidly changing world and grappling with misinformation and trying to find common ground amidst all this cacophony of voices.
Yeah, it's a powerful analogy, and it suggests that maybe we can learn from Lincoln's approach to communication and persuasion in a time that was very divided. He was a master of rhetoric,
Yeah.
but he also understood the importance of listening,
Right.
of empathy and of finding ways to connect with people who had different views.
It makes you wonder, though, are those skills even possible to cultivate in our current climate. I mean, with the constant barrage of information and the echo chambers on social media and the increasing polarization of our political discourse, is civil discourse even possible anymore?
It's a tough question,
Yeah.
but I believe that Lincoln's example offers us some valuable insights. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations, and he didn't resort to demonizing his opponents. He saw the humanity in those who disagreed with him, and he tried to find common ground even when there were profound differences.
I think that's a really crucial point. It's so easy to get caught up in the outrage of the moment, to see the other side as the enemy. But Lincoln's approach, it reminds us that even in the middle of conflict, we need to hold on to a sense of shared humanity, a recognition that we're all in this together.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the most important lessons we can take away from Lincoln's legacy. It's not about, blindly copying his every move or agreeing with all of his decisions. It's about recognizing the principles that guided his actions, the commitment to dialogue,
Right.
the willingness to compromise, the belief in the power of persuasion over force.
Those are powerful principles, and they feel more relevant than ever in our current climate.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put those principles into action? How do we bridge the divides in our own lives and in our communities?
Well, I think it starts with a willingness to listen.
Yeah.
To really hear what others have to say, even if we don't agree with them. It requires a commitment to empathy, to trying to understand the perspectives of those who hold different views, and it demands that we reject that us versus them mentality that's become so common in our political discourse.
Yeah, that's a tall order.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. If we want to create a more just and equitable society, if we want to find solutions to the complex challenges that we're facing, we need to start by rebuilding the foundations of civil discourse,
Yeah.
of respectful engagement, of
Right.
recognizing our shared humanity,
Yeah.
even amidst our differences.
Well said.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Lincoln's, political life, from his strategic maneuvering to his moral compromises to his enduring legacy of finding common ground in a divided nation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear what insights we'll uncover in the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
So stay tuned, folks, because we're about to delve even deeper into the mind and the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. It's interesting, as we've been talking about Lincoln's political life, one thing that's really kind of stood out to me is that he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty.
Right.
He didn't just sit back and issue pronouncements from the White House. He was out there,
He was a pragmatist through and through. I mean, Lincoln really understood that to achieve his goals, he had to get involved in, the messy, often unpleasant world of politics. He had to build coalitions, make compromises, and yeah, sometimes even strike deals with people, that he found morally reprehensible.
It's a good reminder that progress, real progress, rarely comes easy, especially in a democracy. It requires a willingness to engage in the political process, to work within the system, even if it means making some tough choices and accepting solutions that aren't perfect.
And I think that's a really crucial lesson for us today. It's so easy to get disillusioned with politics.
Oh yeah.
To feel like it's just this corrupt and ineffective system.
Right.
But if we really want to see, real change, we can't just disengage. We need to participate, make our voices heard, and hold our leaders accountable.
So you're saying we need to be more like Lincoln, huh? Willing to roll up our sleeves and get involved in the messy business of politics?
In a way, yes, but I also think it's really important to remember that Lincoln wasn't perfect.
Right.
We already talked about his problematic approach to Native American issues and even his stance on slavery. While it ultimately led to emancipation, it was often driven as much by political strategy as by moral conviction.
It's a reminder that even our heroes they're complex figures,
Yeah.
capable of both great good and sometimes, great harm.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to really examine their legacies, I think, to
Yeah.
to learn from both their successes and their failures.
Exactly. The takeaway isn't to just blindly imitate Lincoln or any other historical figure for that matter. It's to recognize that leadership is messy,
Yeah.
that progress is often incremental, and that even the most well-intentioned actions, they can have unintended consequences.
So how do we navigate this complex terrain? How do we balance pragmatism with principle, effectiveness with ethics in a world that often feels like it's spinning out of control?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think Lincoln's life offers us some valuable insights. He understood that to achieve, lasting change, it takes a combination of vision and strategy and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
He wasn't afraid to compromise, but he also had a clear sense of his core values, right? Of the
Yeah.
of the principles that he wouldn't sacrifice.
Yeah, and perhaps most importantly, he had faith in the power of democracy,
Right.
in the ability of ordinary people to come together and build a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the political life of Abraham Lincoln, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from this complex, flawed, but ultimately inspiring figure?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a reminder that leadership is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
It's about constantly learning and adapting and just striving to do the best you can in the face of, often overwhelming challenges.
It's about balancing idealism with pragmatism, recognizing that progress often requires compromise,
Mhm.
but never losing sight of your core values.
And it's about believing in the power of unity, of finding common ground, even amidst profound differences, and working together to create a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. It's been a really enlightening conversation, and I hope our listeners have come away with a deeper understanding of this remarkable figure and how relevant he still is to our own time.
It's been a real pleasure sharing these insights with you and with our listeners. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter most.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time on the deep dive.